Widzimy.
Broadcast is live. It's okay.
Yes, it's okay. Today we are with comrade Bruno, and we will talk about your last article which you published in the Tygodnik. Przegląd magazine. Przegląd.
Oh, yeah.
Yes, it's about the how CIA financed the Polish opposition, the Polish solidarity and stuff like this. I want to say that for me it is not this secret, because all my life I knew that CIA give the money for the Solidarnosc. Everybody in Poland knew this, but nobody have a proof. Nobody speak about this. It was this secret that yes, perhaps yes, and so tell maybe. Okay, let's go.
Okay, no, anyway. Now we have an American document that are proving what we knew already, as you said, and since we already knew that a lot of money and different form of help were going to Poland from the beginning of the 80s, but even earlier, but officially it was an help from trade unions to another trade unions, the Solidarnosc trade union. And that's the basic difference with what we know now. Now we know very well that the money was coming mostly from CIA, and then it was going through AFL-CIO trade unions, which were linked with CIA to different trade unions in Europe helping Solidarnosc. And this is important because during the 80s, United States understood that the traditional way CIA was interfering in political affairs of different countries was not acceptable anyway, was not acceptable by societies and so on. So they begin to modify the system, and the Solidarnosc era, the 80s, were a strategical moment in that move, because at that time they tried to help via trade unions. Later they will create a much better, let's say, system with all these NGOs and so on, and especially with the creation of the National Endeavor for Democracy, which is of course a state organization of the United States, but financing NGOs. And Solidarnosc was a very, very interesting moment, because it was the moment where the United States tactic to interfere in foreign countries was changing, and the example of Solidarnosc helped American to make their system of interference much more let's say, much more sexy, in fact, I can use that term. Up till now, with all what we know under the name of colored revolutions and so on. So it's an important moment. The second thing which is very important to know is that officially we had in Poland two forces which were supposed to be independent. It means Solidarnosc as a trade union and Polish Church, which was, of course, a very old institution in Poland. But now we have documents. We know that there was talks between Ronald Reagan and Pope John Paul II at the beginning of 1982 for a common action in Poland. And now we know that Solidarnosc was not independent, but we know also that the Church, the Vatican, was not independent, but was linked with the CIA activity in Poland. And it's very important because the Church was supposed to be a non-political organization, just a humanitarian and religious organization. And now it happened that the Church was not only politically active, but active with secret services. And also, of course, for financial reason, they were using the bank, the Vatican's bank, in their political strategy. So now everything is clear, I would say. We know that the American government, American secret services took advantage of the crisis in Poland to intervene and to use what was at the beginning a working class movement and changing it in a movement that will change the political system in Poland toward capitalism. I remind that when the Polish workers did strike in the summer of 1980, they were not striking against socialism. They were striking for different reasons, but basically they were striking for an improvement of socialism, but not the replacement of socialism by capitalism. But as soon as the American interfered in this movement, they pushed the elite of Solidarnosc, and especially the so-called intellectual advisors of the union, to be more and more West-oriented in a sense of capitalism, of course, but up to the very end, up to 1989, they didn't tell about that openly. Capitalism capitalism appeared in Poland officially at the end of 1989. Up to that time, Solidarnosc was supposed to fight for a better socialism, for a more democratized socialism, for a more for self-management, and so on and so on. And now we know that it was just a covert action behind what we had already from the very beginning strong neoliberal and pro-capitalist course, and that's very important. And what is very important is also that we have now the documents in United States, and we know more or less how maybe we don't know everything, but at least we know that a lot of money were sent by United States to Poland, and especially there is one man which was very engaged in this direction. It's Irving Brown, who was from the very beginning in the 50s. He was already in charge in the AFL-CIO, in the United States Trade Union, for international relation. And it's obvious that he was linked with CIA, and of course he was very active in the 80s in the direction of Poland. So it shows everything what I said. It shows that the action against socialism in Poland, but of course also in other countries, but let's talk about Poland now. This action was planned from the very beginning, from the 50s. So from the beginning of the 50s, and of course step by step they developed their activity, especially in the 60s, 70s, and of course much more in the 80s. So now we see that the Cold War was not only a Cold War between two superpower in different countries which were disputed between socialism and capitalism, but that from the very beginning, Western imperialism and especially American imperialism developed this strategy of what they will call later the rollback. It means the destruction of socialism. So now, of course, all this literature talking about the massive repression of the state security police in Poland or anywhere in the Eastern Bloc. Of course, we can discuss about that. But anyway, the situation changed very deeply when we know that there was a war of aggression against those governments, against those states, against those countries, and that in such a situation, of course, we cannot look at security services the same way, the same naive way, let's say. Quite a lot of people, even leftist people, were looking at this in the 70s and in the 80s, talking about, those repressive forces against those nice-looking dissidents and those nice democratic trends in Eastern Europe. Now it's obvious that under those democratic trends, or so-called democratic trends, we had to deal with very often with covert action against those countries. Of course, I don't want to tell by that every people active in the anti-communist, or let's say in the dissidents, were agents of the CIA and other Western spying agencies. But objectively, of course, they were, even when they didn't know about that. And it shows the situation in a completely different way than what we are accustomed to. So it's very important what is happening now, because of all those discoveries, we can develop a completely new look at the Cold War as a war of aggression by the imperialist camp against the socialist camp, and not all the legends they built about an undemocratic dictatorship fighting against a pure society wanting just a little bit more democracy.
Okay, I would like to ask you, who profit this money? Because Solidarnosc in the 1980, it was 10 million of people. So, and in your article, you wrote that it was 20 million of the $20 million. So $20 million to 10 million people.
Of course.
So how many people you think that they take this money?
No, the money was going just to the leadership. And of course, it was not always going to make them directly, let's say, rich. But for example, and one of the most important action was the action helping the so-called underground publishing houses. Underground publishing houses were paying to the authors salaries which were higher than the salaries they would have in the official state-owned publishing houses. At that time, it was they were telling that it's the proof that a market-oriented publishing house, even underground, is more efficient than the state-owned socialist state publishing house with their bureaucracy and inefficient system. That was the argument. Now we know that the money that made these publishing houses ready to exist and develop was coming mostly from United States. Of course, you didn't need quite a lot of money, of dollar, in Poland, because we have to remember that at that time we had what we call the black market, and $1 in Poland on the black market was much more was representing much more value than the $1 in the United States. With $1 in Poland, you could live about 1 week. So if you had a publishing house giving to somebody, let's say, $50, which was not very important. Out of 20 million, $50 is not quite a lot of money. In Poland, you could live with like a prince, like a king, changing money on the black market, and that's the point. Because we have to take into account all that black market as a parallel system to the official one, which was destroying the official economy. The state-owned economy was using, of course, this black market course for Western currencies. And people having access to dollars were much richer than Poles earning zlotys, and that's the basic point, because it didn't cost quite a lot to the United States to pay very well Poles working for them directly or indirectly, using this black market exchange rate, and that's why during the 80s, Poles who had access to dollar were much richer than Poles earning normal Polish salary in zlotys. So we can say that in the 80s, the economy was already corrupt by dollar, and the underground activity of Solidarnosc was one of the elements destroying the efficiency of the socialist system, which was able, after the Second World War, to rebuild the country very quickly, to build the new factories very quickly, to develop very quickly the country. But at the beginning of the 70s, when the black market began to develop in a higher stage than earlier, there were always something like a black market, but not as so strong as in the 70s. And in the 80s, it was completely a two-level economy. You have the dollar economy, and you had the official economy, and these two economies were competing inside the same country. So we can say also that the Solidarnosc covert action was also an action of destruction of the national economy, or the socialist economy. And of course, not taking into account the fact that it was corrupting, of course, Solidarnosc leaderships and opposition leadership, but it was also corrupting quite a lot of people from the government who had different way of going accepting dollars in exchange for their, let's say, moderate reaction towards opposition. So that's why we had the legend of a, let's say, terrorist regime repressing very hardly opposition. And in the reality, we had security forces which were not very tough against all dissidents, or all oppositions, because the dollar corruption also contributed to corrupt state security and state officials.
Okay, I would like now ask you about other question, because you said about the CIA used the Catholic Church and the trade unions to give this money. I want to ask you about the left, international left. I especially about the Trotskyist movement. What do you know about? Do you know something about the using Trotsky's organization to giving money the CIA from the West to the Poland? And second question: do you know something about the Polish Socialist Party of the Piotr Ikonowicz? I can say that in 1990s, in the bureau of the Polish Socialist Party in Warsaw, in the Krakowskie Przedmieście Street, there was a big flag with which was written Polska Partia Socjalistyczna Birmingham. And when I ask why it is Birmingham, because this is our comrades who emigrated, they fled the communist regime, and they send us money from the England. They help us to reconstruct the Polish Socialist Party. But for me, it is obvious that if somebody from England send you money to Poland to fight the communism, it's so. What do you say?
It's two different questions. I will one and then answer to the first one and then to the second. What is sure is that you had different Trotskyist organization, and we have to take into account the fact that from the very beginning of the creation of the so-called Lambertist fraction of the Trotskysm after the Second World War in France, these Trotskyists were cooperating with CIA and United States against the Soviet system, against the socialist system, and it was quite obvious and quite general. And of course, they were linked at that time with Americans, and it was more or less official, because their line was that to create an ideal socialism, they must first destroy the pseudo-socialism of the East, and then they will do the revolution in the West. That was their theory, and it was logical for them to take every mean they could to help to overthrow socialism in the West. So this fraction of the Trotskyist movement was, I would say, openly cooperating with Western agencies, with the United States especially. The mainstream, let's say, Trotskyist movement, the so-called Fourth International, was rather acting on intellectual level. They were, of course, hoping a working class revolution in the East and so on and so on. But I would say they were used as, let's say, as useful idiots. Because, in fact, they didn't really had any influence in Poland. They had contact with intellectuals, but they had no real influence. But on the other side, their action was that, you see, there is a left Marxist opposition against that Eastern socialism. It has nothing to do with capitalism. It has nothing to do with liberalism. It has nothing to do with United States, and so on and so on. So they were useful for the counter-revolution, let's say, so to look as true revolutionaries, supporting, of course, Solidarnosc. So that's the second aspect. I would say that the First International, they helped, of course, as they could, Solidarnosc, but they didn't receive a lot of money. They didn't receive money and transmit from the West and transmitting in Poland. They were out of this question, and this also explains why the American didn't want to have the Solidarnosc structure in the West in Paris, where the Trotskyists were strong. They preferred to transfer it to Brussels, where they much better controlled things, because they didn't need to have Trotskyists, this Trotskyist, disturbing them. Because to a certain extent they were disturbing them, even if as I told you, to a certain extent they used them as useful idiots. The second thing you are talking about, the PPS, the Polish Socialist Party, you have to, it's something which is coming from the old history. You had, during the Second World War, quite a lot of socialist, pre-war socialist leaders emigrated, left Poland during the Nazi occupation, and some of them, of course, arrived in London. And of course, the London Polish government was a coalition, as you know, of mostly four parties, among them the PPS, the Polish Socialist Parties. And among those exiles, you have a couple which was called the Ciałkosz. They were old socialists, anti-communists, and when the Polish Socialist movement party was rebuilt in Poland in 1944 and took the side of PKWN, of the Polish Liberation Movement, and then the new Polish People's Republic, Ciałkoszowie, it means the two Ciałkosz in London, created what they called they of course didn't accept this change, and they created the foreign delegation of the Polish Socialist Party. And it existed throughout the times in the 50s, 60s, 70s in England, and they tried, without any success, in fact, they tried to rebuild a socialist party, let's say a right-wing socialist party in Poland. Of course, we can suppose that, but I don't know about that because I didn't check, we can suppose that they get some money, at least because they were a member of the so-called Socialist International. And the Socialist International, it is the international of the Socialist Social Democratic Party. They were a member of it. And of course, this organization has quite a lot of money. Because, of course, you have very strong socialist party like the British Labour Party, like the French Socialist Party, like the Belgian Socialist Party, the German Social Democrats, and so on. And of course, that this tiny Polish socialist group in England, being member of the Socialist International, had money. I don't know. I cannot tell anything about that. I suppose they didn't need to have CIA money because they had the money of the Socialist International, which was very rich, which is up till now a very rich organization, and basing on those very big government parties we have all over Western world. So I suppose it's very, very possible that the money that come from the Birmingham, it means from England, arrived from this delegation of the PPS in England, but the money was rather coming from the Socialist International. But of course, Socialist International was anti-communist, was pro-West, pro-NATO, pro-US, and so on. So for the American, it was good to have Socialist International building Socialist Party in Poland. There was no problem for them with that, but I think that the money was not coming from the CIA. They didn't need money from CIA. They had money from the Socialist International. When the PPS was created in Poland in 1987, very quickly, of course, the Polish PPS, local new PPS, took contact with the PPS delegation from the wartime in London, or London or Birmingham. That I don't really know if it was in Birmingham or in London, but anyway, it was in England. And that's what I would suppose. Of course, we can check, but I didn't check that, so I just tell what looks to me quite logical anyway. Because that's another point, but it's mostly at the end of the 80s and the beginning of the 90s. The Socialist International was very active at that moment in Poland. But its main activity at that time was not to take the control of Solidarnosc. Its main activity was to take control of the PZPR, of the United Polish Workers' Party, taking into account the fact that Mieczysław Rakowski, who was one of the leader of this party, and even he became later the prime minister and at the end the first secretary of this party, had very strong relation, because earlier he was a Polish journalist, and from the 70s he had very good relation with the SPD, with the German Social Democrats, and with the Israeli Labour Party, and they helped him quite a lot to take the control of the PZPR, of the Polish United Workers' Party, and I suppose they give him money to have to reorganize the party in a social democrat direction, mostly German Social Democrats and Israeli Social Democrats.
Last thing which you said, it is the question which I wanted to ask you, but firstly it is the question from chat from Philip Mack. I want only say that today we speak with Bruno, and the live when I will respond the question will be next time. So my question for you, Bruno, is about the CIA and the PZPR, the Polish United Workers' Party, because in 1980s we have all this young generation of the apparatchik from the PZPR who go to the USA. They have studies like there, and after this, when SLD was in power in 2001, 2005, they made many decisions which suppose that they have connection with the CIA. This decision, it was sending Polish troops to the Iraq, sending Polish troops to the Afghanistan, and also they give it was possible to build the secret prison CIA in Poland, in Stareki Kuty.
Yeah, I don't know of everything about that, but I would make difference between the 80s and the 90s. In the 80s, let's say the Polish elite of the Polish United Workers' Party were sent. In fact, they were sent from the end of the 70s up to the 80s, they were sent in United States, but it was mostly economists. And economists were sent to learn, of course, the efficient economics. It means concretely the so-called Reaganomics. They were sent especially to Chicago. The best known man from this activity was Leszek Balcerowicz. He was sent in the United States in 1979 and 1980, and he was he became there neoliberal. And I remember that I remind we have to take into account that at that time Leszek Balcerowicz was in the Central Committee. He had the title of starszy lektor. It means he was the experienced teacher in the Institute of Basic Problems of Marxism-Leninism in the Central Committee. And he was sent in Chicago to learn Reaganomics. So we can say that during the end of 70s and 80s, we had for sure part of the party direction who was sending people, economists. It was still not, their idea was not to change all the system or the elite, but to make the system more efficient in a liberal way. And that's basic. And I have nothing, I didn't have discovered anything that could send those people in the direction of contacts with CIA. They had contacts with economists, with liberal elite in the United States, with business milieu, but I'm not sure, I have nothing to tell that they had some contact with CIA. It's a very big difference at the beginning of the 90s. At the beginning of the 90s, quite a lot of people from the direction of the former Communist Party went to the United States. But when they went to the United States, it was not for studying economy, but they were received at the CIA. Especially there is one man which is very important, it's Leszek Miller. Leszek Miller was one of the top leaders of the former Communist Party becoming Social Democrats. And when he arrived in Arlington, in the United States, he was... he spent 24-hour, non-stop 24-hour in the CIA building. What they did with him, I don't know, nobody knows. But anyway, he was there, I guess, for a hard training. And I guess it's not the only one. I guess we can find other examples. But it's important because Leszek Miller was supposed to be was identified, let's say, at the beginning of the 90s as the leader of the left wing of the Social Democrat Party. So he was supposed to be something like a half nostalgic of Soviet time and socialist regime and so on. And in fact, it happens that he was just playing that role. And that he was trained at the, because if you spend 24 hours in the CIA building, you can be sure it's not for drinking coffee with officers. I mean, they must do something with you very hard and some hard training. So when you're back home, you are their man. And that's in the 90s. It's obvious that they managed to manipulate quite a lot of higher nomenclatura people in Poland, and this led, of course, to what you are talking about with Iraq war and so on and so on. In the same time, I will give you another example from another sector, let's say, in the Polish Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Before 1989, of course, you had the party organizations. And suddenly one of the party organization member was nominated in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs as the government functionary for the depolitization of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. So officially, the politicized communist ministry had to change to something like a civil servant, and he was the man in charge of that. But he was a former Polish United Workers' Party member, and he was directing the depolitization of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. In cooperation with Western embassies, and especially with United States Embassy. And what we know is that very quickly, he was, after having depoliticized his ministry, he was sent to Washington as ambassador of Poland. So we see, you know, if he was named in Washington, it means that he made quite a good job in the direction of I would not say a depolitization of foreign ministry. I would say Americanization of the Polish Ministry of Foreign Affairs. It would be more just to identify it like that.
Okay, the last question which I want to ask you is about the Soviet Union, because it was Poland. It was a secondary country. The most important country was the Soviet Union in the socialist bloc, and all this contribution was possible because of Gorbachev and Perestroika. And this transformation, the talking discussion in the round table in Poland, it was because Gorbachev, he gave his common say swoją zgodę, his accord.
His accord,
yes.
Support.
So my simply question, do you know something about the collaboration of the Gorbachev with the CIA? Because today Gorbachev, he's living in the West. He's living
in Russia.
No, he has a big building in the South German. He received a lot of orders from the
that's for sure. A lot of orders he received
from the president of the United States. That he is the this is orders for the friends of the United States.
Yeah, of course he was a friend. The question is when. I didn't work on that, and I'm not specialist of that, but I know that now in Russia there are historians working on that, and that they found quite a lot of documents, Russian documents, of course, I mean Soviet documents, Russian documents, and also American documents that are showing that very strong relations existed, not only between Gorbachev and the United States, but between quite a lot of higher functionaries of the Soviet Party, even before Gorbachev's. And there are debates among Russian historians when this trend began. If it began in the middle of the 80s, at the beginning of the 80s, and some are telling that even it began in the 70s. That's a question I will not answer to, because I'm not specialist. I didn't work on that, and I cannot tell you something, but I will just point that Russian historians are working on that theme, and that we should observe what they are doing and what they discover and what are the debate, the historical debate on this question. There is something very interesting happening, but I wrote about that. I read about that, excuse me, but no, I'm not the specialist, so I cannot tell more than that.
It's also the question from the chat. What happened to Solidarnosc after the fall of the wall? Are they relevant anymore?
No, I mean, what is very important to know is, first of all, that Solidarnosc in 1981 had 10 million members. Out of these 10 million members, the union was destroyed during the martial law and rebuilt in the underground. In the underground, they had some, let's say, 10 or 20,000 members, no more. What is important is that in 1984, the government of Poland created new trade unions. And in the new trade unions, about half of former members of the Solidarnosc went to the new trade unions, the new anti-Solidarnosc trade union. So we had OPZZ, the new trade union, had 7 million members, and out of these 7 million members, 5 million were former Solidarnosc members. So we can say that the martial law was supported by about half of the former Solidarnosc movement. They will never tell you about that in the propaganda, in Western propaganda, or in Polish Solidarnosc propaganda. But that's a fact, that half of the member of the OPZZ was former union member of Solidarnosc. That's the first point. Second point is that when Solidarnosc was re-legalized in 1989, they couldn't manage to have more than 2 million members. So out of this 10 million they had, 8 million never came back to Solidarnosc, only 2 million. And it was in 1989, 1990. At that time, they began to have crisis. And out of those 2 million, now there are about 200,000, 300,000, no more. So the Solidarnosc we know now has nothing to do with the Solidarnosc of the beginning. But in fact, the Solidarnosc of the beginning disappeared at the end of 1981. Because we have to know something very basic. Solidarnosc made quite a lot of error during the 1981 year. And there is no doubt about the fact that a majority of Poles were in favor of the martial law. Every sociological inquiry we had at that time, but every sociological inquiries we had after 1989 in Poland, so after the regime change, all are showing that the majority of Poles were in favor of the martial law, for different reasons, of course. But among them was the fact that Solidarnosc leadership was not any more considered as the leadership of an organization repairing, let's say, the bad aspects of the government, and began an opposition organization. The majority of Poles were never in favor of destroying socialism. So when the martial law arrived, they supported it because they were already leaving Solidarnosc. So it was not anymore a mass movement. It was a mass movement at the beginning of 1981. But at the end of 1981, it was not anymore a mass movement. And that's why the martial law succeeded. I mean, the martial law, they didn't manage to organize strikes in most of the Polish plants. And all over the 80s, even if Poles were divided about the policy carried on by the government, they couldn't manage to organize mass strike, mass manifestation. They organized some manifestation, they organized some strikes, but they were not strong. And we have also examples. We can, of course, criticize the election system in the 80s, but anyway, there were elections, and during those elections, not a strong majority, but a majority of Poles did vote. So the Solidarnosc, I would say, was just a symbol in 1989. It was not anymore a strong movement. The problem is that in the 1989 elections, theoretically, every party going to the election had the same program. Officially, democratize the system, political system, and after the election, there will be a national debate on the question of how to repair socialism. The question of capitalism was not in the air in June 1989. It was at the end of 1989 that suddenly the government decided, okay, we are going to, and they even at that moment they didn't want to call it capitalism. They were calling it a market economy because they knew that the word capitalism would not be accepted then.
Okay, thank you, Bruno. Thanks to the viewers. First time we have viewers here. It's starting because it is. So we are finished to speak about the Solidarnosc. In 3-5 minutes, you can find the transmission in Polish language, and we will talk about Spain today in the context of the arresting the Pablo Hasél. So goodbye.